We've forgotten that there's a God that we have to answer.
Dealing with people who reject truth.
I'm wondering in my mind why life is so difficult for me.
340 million people who are suffering.
Real stories.
Here's a man who's responsible for almost 7 billion people.
Real issues.
How much does peer pressure actually exist?
And real views.
Gangs exist at every level.
This is Real Talk.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to today's episode of Real Talk USA. We're going to be discussing the issue of the Middle Eastern crisis that is currently at hand and has been so for the past few decades. Now, the Middle East is home and the birthplace of the three great monotheistic faiths today: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All religions of peace. So why are followers so enraged and so full of hate and war? We will be discussing what is affecting this region and ultimately what is hindering world peace. And we will be doing that with an excellent panel and a great audience today. The panelists include Dr. Wasim Sayed, and he is a theoretical physicist, and he has lived in Pakistan, England, Guatemala, and California. And as a result, he knows a lot about human development. Seated next to him, we have Safir Bhatti. He is a PhD student in conflict resolution with a master's in international studies and international peace. And finally, we have Ms. Marsha Kanri. She is the founder of the Dialogue Project. She is a Jewish American who became an Israeli citizen who then left Israel to help the country. She also has a master's of public administration from New York University. Welcome to the show, and we have a great audience here too. So welcome everybody.
Thank you.
So we just off the bat, some opening statements from the panelists. We're trying to get to world peace. As Jews, as Muslims, we want a better brotherhood amongst men and women out there. What is missing from the world today for that to happen?
I personally, since you asked for participation in this program, was thinking on these issues, and I think the most important thing that's missing is a realization that we really are all one. The more and more I think about this region and even the conflict on a national, global kind of a scale, I think the thing that's missing is this concept, this notion, this understanding that what we are all doing or what any of us does affects everybody else. When and if we can get away from this us and them attitude, us and them perception, somehow we in the United States can live amongst ourselves in a situation which is very just and peaceful, and what happens outside or what we do outside doesn't have to have those same principles applied to. It comes essentially, I think, from this us and them attitude and thinking. So I think that's what's missing.
All right, Safir?
In looking at different connotations of what we learn what peace is and how we can actually resolve conflict. There was a statement by Khalifatul Masih Rabi Rahmatullah, who said that the lack of political peace comes when there's a population that's grieving, there's a population that lack the basic needs. And in order to circumvent that and actually address those needs and everything, there has to be some kind of unity. And that's what the famous UN General Assembly President Sir Zafrullah Khan said at one time, that in order to create that type of peace and that journey, we have to create a united federation of states, like we have in the European Union, like we have in elsewhere, where states come together and they become autonomous entities and they work towards each other, towards a goal. And I think that's what's missing right now in the Middle East, that there's no unity. There's a lot of different interpretations of how they want to lead. And they're just battling with each other.
Okay. So, and Marsha?
I'm really glad that you raised the macro issue of finding our common human bonding, and that you raised the specific issue of nation statehood, because you can't just have a macro, and you can't just have, in Judaism we say God is in the details, and yet you have to keep the big picture in front of you as well. What makes for peace is when individuals start to become accountable for their own actions and words and how they are influencing their children, their spouses, their extended family, then the people on their block, then the people in their larger neighborhood. When I lived in Jerusalem years ago, a Palestinian village named Abu Tor, which had been won, and I use that word in quotes, by Israel in one of the wars, was a mixed neighborhood of Palestinians and Israelis. And most of the Jewish Israelis who lived there believed they had come and bought after this particular war, but also felt that they could coexist together. Many of the Jewish Israelis who lived there knew they lived in homes of people who were refugees, and they struggled with that and were looking to their government to provide leadership, a truth and reconciliation process where there would be an acknowledgement that people were displaced and made refugees, where there would be a mechanism not only that their government gives them to go into these homes of refugees, but to also acknowledge and offer compensation and perhaps return those homes. There were many internal struggles, and while the government failed to provide leadership for these types of processes, the people began seeking it. So to me, peace is accountability on the individual level that then works its way out towards the larger group and the larger society.
Now, speaking of these societies, we have two societies. We have the Israeli society and we have Palestinian society. In Palestine, there's a lot of Muslims. In Israel, there's a lot of Jews. Is this a Muslim and Jewish issue that we're seeing over there? Like a Muslim versus Jews thing?
I think the conflict, you know, and I'm glad that Ms. Conner is here because she's bringing up the dialogue project. I think one of the biggest thing is that it says that there's a lot of issues that are going on and there isn't much dialogue between these two groups. And what I feel that the original issue is that it's actually caught up in all this religious scheme of things is that I think it's an economic issue that there's a portion in the southern area of Israel where Palestine meets, where the West Bank is, that there's I think a water canal that's there, and if that water canal goes over to the West Bank, if actually an area does become Palestine, an area does become Israel, and whatever Israel is, you know, they say, oh, you know, we may lose this access to water. So I think it's more of an economic conflict that's actually been fueled in, like, you know, religious violence to stir mobilization. Because if someone says, okay, this is a water conflict, you won't get a lot of people mobilized over this issue. If you want to say this is a religious conflict, this is your religious identity, you have to fight for your religious freedoms, you have to fight for your religious beliefs, then, you know, let's mobilize it under a religious umbrella that's actually been happening. And these forces of mobilization are breaking these people that are once were neighbors every day.
I think economics is a component of it. What Imam Faisal Rauf, the gentleman with the Cordova Initiative and the Park 51 Mosque that caused so many people of ignorance and bias in this country to say awful things about Islam. He is a colleague of mine, and we do not accept what the biased people say. He once made a comment to me, you know, religion misshapes this conflict. It is a conflict of people, an indigenous people, the Palestinians, who in the breakup of the old Western colonial empires never had access, as other peoples of the Middle East did, to the processes that would create the nation state of Palestine. The Jews who took their ancient religious belief, even though most of these Jews were secular Jews from Europe, connected that ancient religious belief to their secular socialist concepts of government and chose that piece of land. So it's truly competing national identities for peoples who are not only Muslim, but Christian as well, and Baha'i and Samaritan. And there are so many, the majority of Palestinians are Muslim. Two competing national identities that are now being polarized by the sectarian religious conflicts that pervade both the Muslim and the Jewish community around the world. So I just wanted to put that in.
There are two comments I want to make on this, along this line. I think the economic issues are really important. And sometimes when I look at this conflict in Palestine, in Israel, I have this very, and I hope I'm wrong, but I have this very sad conclusion that I reach at always, that it may be that the economic issues are such that if peace was to come, the people who are in power in Israel and the people who are in power in the Palestinian areas would lose a great deal of their influence. And that their interest is not in peace. In some sense, many people share this. They say that there is no money in peace. And I think that's one. But I think there is something that's very important at the root of all of this conflict, and that has to do with justice. When you look at this conflict and you go back to 1947 and you look at the history, and you try and maybe as we did, we went to the United Nations speeches that were made by Sir Zafrullah Khan, by the way, who was the foreign minister of Pakistan at the time. And he captured the essence from the point of view of justice of what was happening. And I think when there is injustice and when the land of a people is taken and given by somebody whom it didn't belong to others who came and who, as you said, they were secular, yet they had this desire. And I know it's history, but I think that root injustice continues to be a source, a sort of a festering wound that continues to provide those people who have the economic interest to continue in power, to want to stay in power and whatnot. So it's a combination of those two things, justice and economics.
Now, recently, the fifth Khalifa of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community addressed the members of Congress at Capitol Hill, and he spoke about a just, independent, and peaceful society, how to reach it. What are some things that His Holiness spoke about that could be applied to the situation there?
When I was listening, I was there, I was listening to him speak, and his basic thesis was that if you want peace worldwide, you have to have justice implemented. And he made the statement that, you know, most intelligent people know that when you have justice in a society, you don't have conflict. If you don't have justice, if you don't have people being dealt with properly, everybody being given his due, you begin to lay the foundation for conflict, if not today, then tomorrow. And I always wonder if we have a United States of America in which the law of the land, the Constitution is supreme, and we have a Supreme Court, and we have 50 states, and yet they're able to function with each other. Why is it that we cannot envisage a world in which there are 192 states working under a supreme law which all accept and which is enforced, and then justice reigns? And I think this was really at the Capitol Hill, hearing Hazrat Khalifatul Masih, who is the head of our community, talk about this. I met with Ms. Lantos after the event, and she was saying, you know, he needs to go, or he needs to be heard by President Obama. And this message of justice between nations needs to be talked about and promoted and understood and more widely appreciated. And it would certainly go a long way towards establishing peace, you know, internationally.
In our dialogues where Palestinians and Israelis, Jewish Americans, Muslim Arab, Muslim South Asian, and Muslims from all over the world meet, they don't just come once, they come with an intention and a commitment to learn the skills of listening generously with your heart, reflecting what the other person says, even if what they say drives you wild, and trying to identify how you feel, not what they are doing to you, as in, you attacked me, and pointing a finger outward, but here is how I feel, taking responsibility and what I know, sharing their personal experience, which is tied to the macro political experiences, the historical experiences. And they come up with words and they have different meanings. As a woman whose fiance was murdered by a terrorist cell, who had to make a choice about how I go forward in life, I had to go through many processes of healing, which then became intertwined with my political choices in Israel and in the United States. and which became intertwined with my education and willingness to read and learn about the narrative and history of the Palestinian people and of the Arab peoples, not only of Arab nationalist movements and those internal conflicts that involved religious nationalism versus secular nationalism, not only my own narrative. The word justice for me may have meant something different than for my Palestinian colleague in my first dialogue circle, who told me his village had been ethnically cleansed. I was a Jew and a grandchild of victims of the Holocaust, people who had been rounded up, who had been burnt alive in gas chambers. I never heard that Jews ethnically cleansed people. I only heard that others ethnically cleansed Jews. That caught me so much by surprise. I had to sit in my chair, and if I had not been committed to saying, I am here to hear you, I don't know if my journey would have begun that could begin a political movement. And so that person's idea of justice was a return to his land, which is now a runway at Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv. My concept of justice is it was wrong, and I want my history books to teach that. How can I compensate for that? I can acknowledge the wrong. I can compensate, but I don't think I can tear up the runway. So the ideas of justice can be different, and I know that's what you're studying, how to deal with that in conflict resolution. So I'd like to hear your...
Oh, yeah, it's interesting that you brought up, and I think sometimes that's all it takes, is just listening. You know, there's those people who have been afflicted with violence and hatred, and from the tales of those Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda to people who are in Palestine and Israel, these people whose homes were blown up by each other, for the forces of each other, their narratives weren't heard. You know, why were feeling so much pain. And sometimes, as you said, that because the idea of dialogue is that when people even say that this is my pain, they don't reflect their listening. They don't use a compassionate listening towards. They just block everything out and say okay, and then goes from one year to the next. And it's really important, I think, that if you really want to heal, that you have to use this type of reflective listening, that a person can actually go across and heal themselves, and I think that
to achieve justice.
To achieve justice, exactly. And I also feel that in the Holy Quran it also talks about that, and it talks about well, more so to the leadership of individuals, that if there are two people that you're sitting with, you have to lead, and if you're appointed as a leader, you have to lead equitably, and you have to lead with justice.
Now, you've made some good points about listening actively.
Right.
Audience has been listening actively, so let's hear what some questions, some comments.
In the Muslim world, you know, you have Arabs and then you have the Muslims who are not Arab. And there was an article last week in the New York Times that before Israel was created, there was 850,000 Jews living in the Arab world. And at this time, that number is down to minuscule because they have all immigrated out of the Arab world. And in Islamic history, we read that whether it was the Turkish Empire or even the golden era of Islam, that there were many Jews who lived in Muslim, under the Muslim countries, under the governments, and they were in position of power. They were great business people. What has changed over the last 65 years? Can Jews or can Muslims accept Jews living and prospering in their countries, or something, or is there too much hate that has been developed over the past 65 years that previous history cannot repeat itself?
I think that there has been a huge there's been a lot of misinterpretation of the religious fundamentals. I mean, the first treaty that we signed in Medina, the first treaty known according to international law, known according to our history books, was a treaty signed with Jews of Medina, and that was to guard them that, you know, we're not going to force religion on you. We're not going to coerce you to join our forces. We're going to live together in peace, right? And this was the treaty that Sallallahu made with Jews of Medina. This was the first treaty that was signed. So, and there's clauses after that of, you know, there's in Constantinople, I think, there, you know, how we have to also protect Christians as well. So I think that what is going on is that people are shifting away from the practices of Holy Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and what is going on is that they're using their own religious beliefs or their own interpretations of the religion to fuel hatred for other things to suit their own political motives.
I think it relates to something Dr. Saeed said as well, that, and he was giving into the cynical component of himself when he said this. I think you said that, you know, there are forces that are just wanting to have access to resources, the economy, the water, the oil, that use violence and manipulation of people who just want to live their lives to incite that polarization that you're talking about. And so the best thoughtful leadership, political leadership, works with the people who are involved in our fields to bring that up and to even begin practicing it in their own way of creating policy and negotiating. But we don't have the best political leadership in many of the countries of the Middle East. And we see that as the Arab Spring has reawakened these old sectarian as well as secular national conflicts that were never put to rest, but only suppressed when the British and the French and the Portuguese carved up their former empires. And so there was never a natural evolution that would have been, I think, bloody and very violent. And now it's erupting. And I want to relate that to this teaching of the Quran, because my undergraduate degree and my love is the academic study of religion. As a young woman, I wanted to know why the world hated Jews. I did hitchhike throughout Palestine during the first Intifada, and which was 1986 and 1987, as a single Jewish woman. And I never felt physically threatened. I believe it is the Muslim culture that so honored hospitality and the sanctity of a young woman, by the way, that protected me. And I also felt the fact that I was really curious to learn the narrative of the students and women who led that Intifada nonviolently, though there were political leaders amongst their own population that manipulated them and took that authentic uprising and quest for freedom and self-determination and made it about something else. And again, took the religion and manipulated people into using the religion as a tool for furthering political ambition.
Marcia, I think you have that. That is my own personal analysis, that so far as the faith is concerned, Islam itself, when you read the Holy Quran, again and again, it tells you that do not let even the enmity of a people incite you to act otherwise than with justice. And you cited the historical situation that Jews occupied very politically powerful offices, they lived, they flourished. This was a time when, in order to begin the crusade, a whole village was slaughtered by the Christians. Exactly. And then they took, this was a kind of a way to bless the trip. And, God would therefore cause to have them become successful. So to go from that to a situation today where, in order to gain and maintain political power, an ignorant mullah, a religious divine in a Muslim country, he uses or abuses religion in order to continue to do the kind of things that in fact are leading to many Jews having to move away from these countries. But I think it is an abuse and a misapplication of the faiths.
Now, speaking of faith, a lot of Ahmadi Muslims are neither Israeli nor Palestinian. And Marcia, being somebody who has been in Israel and Palestine, and Safir and Wasim, knowing the sermons of the 4th and 5th Khalifa and the 2nd and 3rd as well regarding these issues, knowing the speeches of Zafar al-Khan Sahib about Palestine and how he was so outspoken about it, how can the South Asian Ahmadi Muslims, how can the American Ahmadi Muslims, what should we be doing to help world peace in the Middle East?
I personally think the greatest thing that we can do, and this is one of the most powerful tools, and it goes to our faith. we've been taught from birth that the most powerful weapon that we have in this age is the power of prayer. We believe in the existence of one God, not in an abstract sense, not in a sense which is academic in that we look at nature and we see that, you know, everything is the same here as it is in England. You know, not the man-made things over there. You can see that the roads are such that people are driving on the other side and so on. And you begin to think that there are other creators. So we're not taught a belief in the unity of God within Ahmadiyya Muslim community, at least as an academic thing, but as a real thing. As the most potent way of effecting change is to pray to God and ask for His help in being able to convey this message of the sameness of all of humanity. As God is one, mankind is one. And therefore treat with each other on an equal footing. What you would like to see happen here in the United States, wish that it also happens in Lebanon and in Syria. The way that we treat each other here, we should try and treat other people over there. And the second component of what we need to do, I think, is involve ourselves in conveying these same things to our political leaders, to our people on the Capitol Hill. And the effort that we undertook as members of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community here in the United States to have the head of our community go to the Capitol Hill and have the congressional leaders from both sides of the aisle come and listen to him, I think that was a part of that. So those are the two things that I would suggest.
And to the audience members, especially, you know, those who, you know, are in the workplace, you know, sometimes this conversation topic arises in those conversations at the water cooler. Or if you're in college, there's always some sort of a program happening about this. What have you seen? What are your thoughts about it? And how have you been able to help the effort?
For the young generation in America, in most cases, they do live in harmony, and religion and bias is not necessarily in their blood. So if you consider this issue, which is from the perspective of America, it's a remote, foreign, localized problem that somehow we have globalized it and made an issue out of it. But for the next generation, if you ask them, for a lot of them, they would not really be able to articulate why it started. And does it make sense after 60 plus years to continue this hatred onward? So obviously from both sides of the political spectrum and from the Muslims and Jews, there are, as Syed Sahib has mentioned, there are some folks who might want to continue on the path of violence because it may be profitable to some extent. But how do we recognize that and ensure that our future generation realizes that, you know, world peace is bigger than that and understand the difference?
So in this part one of the show, we've talked about how the Middle East needs a real talk, and they need a real listen to promote an active dialogue to find some sort of peace. In the next part, we'll talk about what our leaders in the Ahmadiyya Muslim community have talked about and whether anybody has listened to that. Join us for part two in just a few minutes.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ala ali Muhammadin kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim innaka Hamidum Majid. Allahumma barik ala Muhammadin wa ala ali Muhammadin kama barakta ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim innaka Hamidum Majid.
Welcome back to the show. In part two, we will be discussing a few additional things. We will talk about the epic book by the fourth Khalifa, The Gulf Crisis and the New World Order. We will talk about the speeches and the writings of Zafar al-Khan Sahib, who was a leading jurist in the international community, and what his thoughts on the Palestinian issue was. And we'll also hear from the audience about their personal experiences in experiencing sectarian conflict and what they feel they can do when things just seem out of their control. So moving to the panelists, we have a series of sermons delivered by the fourth Khalifa. They're all encapsulated in the book called The Gulf Crisis and the New World Order. How do what those speeches say back in the 90s, how are those coming to truth today?
When people talk about the Arab Spring, my mind, looking at what's happening and what's following, it goes back to those sermons which I listened to when the Gulf crisis was taking place. And one of the points made in that book, in those sermons, very clearly was that a lot of the policies that governments follow, which are based on their philosophy of whatever is in our interest, is what we will do, regardless of whether its implications for justice are met or not. He used to say, Hazrat Khalifatul Masih IV would say that these policies sow the seeds for future conflicts. And when these seeds bloom, and they go and they have a war and they, harvest them, so to speak, and the cycle again starts. And until and unless those fundamental issues of justice are met and people treat each other at the level of nations. Marsha, you talked about peace starting from the home. Indeed it does. It starts actually from the individual. It goes into the family, it then permeates, into the neighborhood, and then the city, and then the state, and then nationally and internationally. So I think those things are what make me somewhat cynical. I don't really have that much hope of what Arab Spring is being talked about. It seems to me that, again, the people who are replacing the previous leadership, unless they start and unless we start collaborating with them on the basis not of what is in our interest only, but supplant it and support it and mix it with the requirements of justice, this cycle will just continue.
I also agree to that. I think that it's we as Muslims we look to our internal jihad for our external jihad, right? We struggle every day for peace. I think another central point, if I remember, was that there was a discussion on the issue of sovereignty, where in Western polity and in Western frameworks, sovereignty usually rests with man or usually rests with the nation state itself or the state. But in Islamic principles, sovereignty has to be rest with God. If Allah Ta'ala is al-Malikul Mulk, right, the possessor of all sovereignty, right, and if He is also al-Muqtadir, who is the possessor of all power, then if states can understand that sovereignty does not rest with you, right, that your freedom it rests with God. And you're accountable to God. And if God is the sovereign, meaning it's non-territorial, it's indivisible, it's inalienable, it's truly absolute justice, right? Then the only one appointed person, who represents sovereignty is a Khalifa. And and that's the best representative of a sovereign government is one Khalifa. And Hazrat Khalifatul Masih Sani radhiyallahu anhu discussed that the Khalifa should not, participate in like the governmental ideas. There should be statesmen, should be administer these things. He should administer in the moral virtues of mankind. And once I think the Middle East realizes that the missing link is that their sovereignty rests with people or with states, not with God.
I want to just want to add. I think this concept needs a little bit of clarification. As I understand the concept within Islam of sovereignty, ultimate sovereignty indeed lies with God. And the point is that those of us, there is a hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said that each of us is a sovereign and is answerable to God for those who are under His care, our family and children and so on and so forth. And the statement is that whoever becomes a sovereign or is bestowed government in whichever way, whether it is through democracy or whether it is through kingship by hereditary means, it is a trust that they are accountable to God for. And that trust, the way that they discharge, is limited by, and this is what the Quran says, that when you are called to discharge your trust of voting, appoint and select those people who are most suited to the role that you are electing them for. This is one guidance. And the second is that once you become given the power, you are the one who is elected, then discharge your obligations with the requirements of justice. And yes, indeed, I think in many Muslim countries, and Hazrat Khalifatul Masih, the head of our community currently, has counseled, he's written letters, and not only to our, and I wanted to come to that, you were talking about, communication, both of you. Yours is the dialogue project, you were saying we need to talk. Just a few months ago, he wrote a letter to, the Prime Minister of Israel, Mr. Netanyahu.
Bibi Netanyahu.
And he wrote a letter to Ahmadinejad, the president of Iran. And in the letter that he wrote to Mr. Netanyahu, he said, and he counseled that, you want to try and settle the dispute and the worries that you have on the basis of discussion and dialogue. He quoted from the Bible. He asked him that listen to this, in Zabur, I think it is the statements that are stated is that have faith in God and try and resolve the dispute without going to war. And to Ahmadinejad, he wrote and counseled him from the Holy Quran. And he, again and again, he quoted 2 verses specifically, that even if there is an enemy that you perceive of yours, don't act with injustice, act always with justice. He quoted him from the Holy Quran, the unchangeable word of God, the one that has remained the same for the last 1400 years. So this is, I think, very important. Dialogue, talking, and having faith in God.
Let's take it to the audience real quick.
Hi. Shalom and Assalamu alaikum. I have a comment that you look at the 10 commandments of the Judaism, or you look at the 10 conditions of initiation of Ahmadiyya Muslim community, or you look at any other teaching of any other religion. No religion teaches hatred or racism or discrimination on the basis of race, caste, creed. So I have a strong doubt and a strong feeling that people who are aggressors are not following their religious teachings.
We talk about culture, we talk about cultural attachments, faith attachments, and national attachments. And so in dialogue, and also in Ireland, for example, difference is allowed in the room, like acknowledging the difference. For example, for secular people like myself, the concept of a religious component of government is very frightening. I have working with me in the office an Iranian-American Muslim young woman who feels the Ahmadinejad political party and the mullahs are all the problem in Iran, for example, and that the people, the young women like herself, and she is a deeply spiritual Muslim young woman. She loves her faith. It sustains her. It nourishes her. But she does not like her democracy sacrificed at the altar of her faith. She does not go for that.
I think this separation of church and state is very important for us as Ahmadis. The discussion that I think needs to take place in many Muslim countries is around the concept of the Holy Quran and what it teaches and what kind of governments it allows or tolerates, and the history of how Islam developed. In the Holy Quran, there is no concept of territory when it comes to faith. There is a verse, a very well recited and remembered, almost every child memorizes this surah. It's called Surah Al-Nasr, in which God talks about you witnessing the armies entering into Islam. So it's not the concept. Many people who are accustomed to reading the Bible or the Vedas and other scriptures, they may find this very strange, but the Quran talks about armies invading the land of Islam, because the land of Islam is the heart.
So it's a metaphor? Is that what
yes,
you're saying?
yes.
It's a metaphor. It's not talking about military armies.
No, it's talking about the people entering the faith. And but the word it uses is you see troops entering the fold of Islam. And you read the whole of the Holy Quran. It doesn't talk about troops of Muslims entering the lands of infidels and whatnot. It doesn't mention it at all. Troops are mentioned when it comes to troops entering the faith of Islam. That is the victory which is the permanent victory. It's the victory that all religions...
Spiritual victory. So it's humans in our imperfection who misinterpret these sayings in our faith texts. As in Israel, we've got secular Jews in the government who use the faith text to defend bad, oppressive policies of the occupation. And we've got religiously motivated, some of my family, who live on settlements, who, because they believe in it literally and don't take the ethic, the moral ethic from the lesson of the Bible, they translate it to suit their purpose. And that is, to me, an abuse of my faith.
It indeed is, and it's something which is prevalent in many faiths. As you go through faiths, they're moving away from the founder, the spiritual person who was revealed to by God. And you know, the motto of our community is love for all, hatred for none, and I always justify it on the basis of the belief in the oneness of God, who created all of us. If we profess love for Him, how can we have hate for His creation? And how can we not love His creation? And you know, so much comes from that simple fundamental teaching. But coming you know, to the topic that you're talking about right now here, that how is it that still there is so much hatred and so much, what should we say, conflict in the region in which we are talking about, in Iran and many of the Muslim countries? It is going back to the abuse that you talked about of people who are really engrossed in the worldly things, and they want to use religion as a tool which, you know, to misguide people and to have them essentially, you know, follow them as sheep.
Now let's take it to the audience.
Suppose right now it's basically Israel and Palestine, right? So do you believe that if maybe it was more of a unified country, or like the government, it was held over by not just Jewish or Muslims, for different sect or religion, Christianity or whatever, would there be any conflict as to this whole fighting going on? Because from my standpoint, it sort of looks like it's just really nationalism going on, because you also have some towns that are living peacefully. I mean, what are your views about that?
In our dialogues, the thing that shocks most non-Jews is how fearful Jews are, and if there are Israelis also sitting in there, how afraid they are, just as vulnerable they feel. A young man who just came out of the army and had all the resources of that big military, the fourth largest army in the world, behind him, sits in the dialogue and shakes and cries because of what he faced while in uniform that so frightened him, even though what he faced was a woman and a child. And that's the biggest shock. That's where the differences, and we allow the differences to emerge. That is a really hard thing for people to make space for inside of themselves. That fear and that vulnerability of what you or someone may perceive as a powerful person because of all those resources, including the resources of what is seen as a Jewish government. This is the contradiction. For Jews, too, it's an internal conversation with us. It is a big conversation in the worldwide Jewish community about the character of this country called Israel. How can you say you will have social, political, economic equality and still have a Jewish country? And the more extreme elements, the religious extremists particularly, who interpret that then as a right given to them by God to keep expanding into the ancient kingdom that is described in the Hebrew Bible. How can you, it is a great debate in the worldwide Jewish community. The majority of Jews in the United States are of my background. We are not very observant, but we are very committed to our prayers, our faith, and the ethics, the lessons that we get from those teachings. And so we do not focus on the letter of the law, we focus on the spirit of the law. For most of the 6 million Jews in the United States, over 55% of them, while they want to see Israel remain a Jewish state for a sense of safety in the world, based on the thousands of years of persecution Jews have experienced when living in non-Jewish countries and where they were guests in other countries, even wonderful, protected, and respected guests. They absolutely agree with me that Israel has to confront that it may not be a Jewish majority state in the future, and that if it is going to be a Jewish majority state, it must grant full, equal civil and political rights to all of its citizens. Palestinian Israelis, for the most part, if there was a Palestinian state, would probably not move to that state. What they would have as an equal citizen is the 20% of the financial resources of the country that they do not have now. The ability to buy a house in any neighborhood, to go to school in any neighborhood, the ability to travel freely to visit their in-laws living in the state of Palestine, which they cannot do now. That's for the Palestinians, Arab, Christian, and Muslim, who live inside Israel.
Now, I think one of the dangers of the merger between church and state happened a few years ago, I believe, in Israel, where the Rabbinical Council wanted to have a definition of who is a Jewish person.
You know, this is
And we see the same thing happened in Pakistan, where they have defined who is a Muslim.
And therefore, you are already excluding
exactly
and depriving others of their real basic human rights when you do that.
Exclusionary ideology. You're
Right.
subjecting a population that you're going to be exclusive from parameters of rights and parameters of laws, and being an exclusive body, you're not entitled to these different type of rights.
And we actually have some members in the audience who have seen that sectarian conflict in Pakistan and in other nations.
I experienced a lot of those things there when I grew up there. So then I came here. So what we did, I was like asking to myself, like what we can do. So as an Ahmadi Muslim, there was like a lot of hatred around. So we invite the people to our house, have a dialogue, have like interfaith meetings, question answers. So it made a lot of effect. It changed people. A lot of them, like their mind was changed. Like they like heard a lot of different things from the mullahs, and like it made a difference. But it wasn't like that much difference. So we are keep doing it there. Even in my house, we're still doing it. And people, out of like a lot of hatred, they still come. And they attend those meetings. And it's basically the dialogue and having conversation. That is the key.
In Pakistan, they defined a group of people who are Pakistanis and erstwhile were considered full citizens and Muslims. They defined them to be non-Muslims for the purposes of the constitution. They did not define. In fact, the most famous inquiry that happened in a era, long gone by, was the one that was conducted in, I think, 1953-54 when riots took place. And they established a commission to try and ask who exactly is a Muslim. And the big conclusion of that report was that no two Muslim divines could agree on the definition of who is a Muslim.
They asked a lot of sects.
They asked a lot of people. They asked everybody. And in 1974, to avoid all of those problems, the then Prime Minister of the country, essentially pushed through legislation to say that the members of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, whether of this type or of that type, are not Muslims for the purposes of the constitution. But and this is the same kind of thing, I think, which in some sense the citizens of Israel are having to struggle with. But the original intent of those two countries, however, was to protect
Right,
a
the
minority in another country. For example, Muslims in Pakistan who are supposed to be safer from the influences of the majority Hindu population in India, which was about to be partitioned. And Israel, of course, they had a much wider scope, I think, of intentions. But again, it comes back to that conclusion that you had very succinctly summarized in the beginning, Marsha, that you hate and cringe at the idea of religion and state being mixed. And I think that is something which we can all agree to, probably.
And to the audience.
Assalamu alaikum and shalom. This question kind of takes it back to an earlier point in the discussion. I think when Safir Bai opened, he mentioned talking about like the globalization of this localized conflict. And as someone who grew up in kind of like a post 9/11 world, the way the media has kind of portrayed it, I kind of see Israel and Palestine as a microcosm of like the larger, I don't know, kind of east-west maybe mentality. And I think that definitely, like, you need to take action at the localized level, but how do you kind of get past that that cultural rift maybe that has kind of been the larger theme?
And are there too many hands in the cookie jar?
Well, just to say that, I really appreciated when you just spoke about Islam, the Islamic approach, and what the West doesn't understand. Though I may have a difference with you if the Islamic approach could be any more helpful, what I do agree with you about is this idea that, the West is moving forward, short-term answers, do it now, get it done, confident that we are right and that our form of democracy and pluralism is the only shape democracy and pluralism can take, when it's actually an experiment in the West. And who is to say what democracy and pluralism will look like in the East as it goes through this cycle of violence it's experiencing now, because the suppression of dictatorship has been removed or is being removed, and all the old conflicts that were never resolved are bubbling underneath. So we need to know that when you're a historian or you look at the study of religion and culture and nation state, you really look at it historically. It's a process, and I do not mean to be to dismiss one death or one tragedy for any family. Any family. What I don't want is for any culture to continue to celebrate the death as part of a movement forward. It needs to mourn that death and say, what do I do to move us forward, to bring us to the specifics now that you asked about. There are teams of Israelis and Palestinians quietly meeting, discussing all these issues. If we had a joint water commission, how would we make decisions about allocating the water given there is a water shortage in the whole region? If we had a shared Jerusalem, how would we handle policing? And what about emergency medical services? Would the Red Crescent and what we call the Mogen David Adom, that's the Jewish Star, merge? And would the Red Crescent come to my predominantly Jewish neighborhood? These are the real practical ways of creating peace on the ground. If we did joint curriculums, they are meeting and developing them. Will you teach about the Jewish history in the world and persecution, as well as why that persecution took place, separate from your belief about it, but the actual reality of it? Will you teach about indigenous Palestinians on the land for 1,000 years and how land and Palestinian identity are so intertwined intertwined? We Jews do not have an understanding of land in that, from that perspective.
Well, Marsha, some closing thoughts on the matter as we wrap up the show.
I know for many people around the world, with the violence of the United States military, the violence of Muslims and Arabs killing each other, with violence all over the world, also in Latin and South America, one feels there's no way out. I am a woman who not only lost a loved one and many loved ones to violence of that conflict, I am also a former Army person. And I am sharing with you that it starts with you. Make the change within yourself. Develop your mindfulness and your righteousness. Bring it to your family, your children. If you don't know about someone who is not an Ahmadiyya, say, let me learn about that other culture. And I will learn about you. You will be creating the change that will begin to affect your family and your village. And the other thing I have to say is that it is not easy to practice mindful nonviolence and compassion. In a way, the armies, I'm going to go look up that surah that you mentioned. Those spiritual armies that you're talking about are us. We have to become the change we want to see in the world, which is what Gandhi taught us. And that means we have to be a tough army of compassionate, spiritual practitioners of nonviolence. But we can be that army, and it is happening. Palestinians and Israelis, you're not seeing it, but we can bring movies and show you newspaper articles about how they are working together regardless of what their internal politics are. So believe that.
Thank you. Sophia.
We need to move beyond the word toleration, and we need to endeavor towards the word acceptance. I think we need to learn to accept one another. We need to stop trying to change other people's cultures. We need to accept what other people's cultures are, because culture is a very important part of our identity. These are our shared characteristics, things that we align to every day. These are things that we place on our hierarchy that forms our identity of who we are. So we don't want other people to change our identity. We need to start accepting other people's identities. And the best way to do that is through a very simple message. It's called RUCAT, right? RUCAT is, it starts with R. In order for you to do this to someone else, you need to do this to yourself. You need to respect yourself. You, understand yourself. A, appreciate yourself. C, care for yourself. A, accept yourself. T, trust yourself. If you can do these easy steps, there will be more peace in the world. Thank you, Salam.
I will just end with what I started with. I think the statement really is, and I think in some sense it captures all of what both of you have said. That is that the whole of this world today is really, it's not even a metaphor anymore. It is a village. And we are all one, as God is one. And I think when we continue to begin to fulfill that purpose that Islam has given its believers, that learn to love God and become like God. When I had my first grandchild, this was something that came so, you begin to understand what creation is and what providing for your children is, and what immense love God has placed in the heart of a human being. And it is something that everybody has. It's not just that I have it and the others don't have it. Everybody has that. And when we begin to start to think that we believe in this one God whom we love endlessly, there are people who are willing to give their lives for that love, if we can just infuse that in ourselves to the extent that it begins to infect everybody else, then I think we are making progress, and then we are making headway towards trying to have the world change and become cognizant of this fundamental truth that God is one, we are one, and we should have and expect to do for the other just the way we want Him to do for us.
And with all that in mind, we had a great discussion, some great questions and comments from the audience. And whether you say Allah or Yahweh, know that God doesn't just love exclusively. And whether you say Shalom or Salam, know that peace isn't also mutually exclusive. You can share your stories with us at our email address, share your comments at our Twitter page, and most importantly, visit our website to tell us how you feel. Assalamu alaikum.